Imagine living in a world where most of the planet is still a mystery, where vast lands await discovery and adventure is just around the corner. Let's embark on a fascinating journey through time, exploring the last lands discovered by humans. From humanity's first steps in Ethiopia to the daring expeditions that ventured into the most remote corners of the globe, we'll see how our ancestors transformed an unknown world into a fully mapped one. And what if I told you that there was a time when Antarctica hadn't yet been seen by human eyes, while we had already observed Uranus in the sky? Curious to know more? Stick around as we travel through the centuries of human exploration. Today, it feels like the world is full of people. After all, there are 7.4 billion of us. It seems like every place has already been discovered. We have satellites, the International Space Station, GPS, and explorers like this gentleman here. But it hasn't always been this way. The world used to feel much larger. The question is, where and when did humans discover the last piece of uncharted land on Earth? To start right from the beginning of humanity, let's travel back to Ethiopia in 195,000 BCE. We don't know exactly when humanity discovered specific parts of the world at that time, but we have our best guesses based on fossil evidence. So, let's go with those for now. The oldest Homo sapiens fossils discovered so far were found in Ethiopia, so human exploration most likely began here. With an entire world to explore, it took until about 140,000 to 160,000 years ago for humans to reach what is now Sudan. But by around 125,000 years ago, humans had already reached the southern tip of the African continent and, at the same time, had also crossed the sea to the Arabian Peninsula, what is now Yemen. This new group of humans based in Arabia arrived in Israel roughly 100,000 years ago and reached Oman somewhere between 75,000 and 125,000 years ago. Back in Africa, around 90,000 years ago, humanity reached what is now the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Heading back to Asia, 70,000 years ago, humans arrived in India, and by 67,000 years ago, they reached the Philippines, marking the first time humans reached Oceania. Humans arrived in Taiwan about 50,000 years ago, and between 50,000 and 48,000 years ago, they reached Egypt for the first time. Humans set foot in Australia 48,000 years ago. These early settlers of Australia and their descendants would remain almost entirely isolated from the rest of the human population until 1770, with the arrival of Captain James Cook, a guy who had quite an adventurous spirit. We'll talk more about him later. Around 47,000 years ago, humans reached Japan, and 1,000 years later they arrived in Laos and Indonesia. Finally, 45,000 years ago, humans reached Greece, marking the first place and the first time humans set foot in Europe. Usually, when humans arrive somewhere for the first time, things start dying off. So naturally, Europe's Neanderthals mysteriously vanished around 5,000 years later. Humans settled in Italy around 43,000 years ago and, based on fossil records, somehow skipped over France and made it to the UK around 43,000 years ago, and then to Germany 42,000 years ago. On the other side of the world, humans discovered China between 39,000 and 42,000 years ago, Tasmania around 41,000 years ago, and New Guinea about 40,000 years ago. A bit later, some 34,000 years ago, humans discovered Sri Lanka, and then came upon yet another new continent. North America was settled between 25,000 and 40,000 years ago via a land bridge that existed back then, because walking was a bit easier than inventing boats to sail across the ocean. This is why there were millions of people already living here when Columbus arrived. Anyway, Around 28,000 years ago, much of Europe had already been explored, including France, the Czech Republic, Romania, Poland, and Russia. Portugal was finally reached 24,500 years ago, and Sicily about 20,000 years ago. Strangely, this means humans reached North America before they reached Portugal. The continental United States was first reached about 16,000 years ago, and humans made it to South America some 14,800 years ago, where the oldest fossils were found in Chile. Back on the other side of the ocean in Europe, Scandinavia was settled by humans around 9,200 BCE and Ireland in 7,700 BCE. The Baltic states were colonized around 7,600 BCE. In Asia, Cambodia was reached by 7,000 BCE, and a super remote island north of Siberia called Wrangel Island was discovered around 6,300 BCE, which is strange because there was still so much left to explore. Returning to continental regions, Malta was discovered in 5,200 BCE, and across another ocean, Puerto Rico was reached by 4,000 BCE. Greenland was reached by 2000 BCE, and the islands of Fiji, Vanuatu, and Samoa were settled around 1000 CE by the Polynesians. Then a while passed without new discoveries until 290 CE, when Hawaii was also finally discovered by the Polynesians. They remained there undisturbed by the rest of humanity until 1778, when that same explorer, James Cook, had to land on their islands too. Finally, the next big discovery was Madagascar. Despite its huge size and its proximity to Africa, humans didn't settle Madagascar until around 500 CE. The Roman Empire rose and fell, yet during all that time, no humans had set foot in Madagascar. Oddly, the first settlers didn't come from nearby Africa as you'd expect. They paddled in canoes all the way from Borneo, crossing the vast Indian Ocean. Moving forward, the Faroe Islands north of Scotland were discovered around 600, the Bahamas around 850, and Iceland remained untouched by humanity until the 9th century. Vikings found it in 874 CE. The last significantly large and habitable place to be discovered by humans was New Zealand, which didn't see any human presence until the arrival of the Maori Polynesians between 1250 and 1300. Then we enter the great age of European exploration, which resulted mostly in scattered island discoveries. The Portuguese were the first humans to set foot on 6 of these in a row: Madeira in 1420, the Azores in 1439, Cape Verde in 1462, Annobon in 1474, São Tomé and Príncipe in 1485, and a Portuguese soldier in exile landed on St. Helena in 1516. The only places where the Spanish were the first to arrive were the Bonin Islands, south of Japan, in 1543, and the Polynesians reached the Chatham Islands in 1550, their last recorded discovery. Back in Europe, the frozen Svalbard was left untouched by humans until an English whaler landed there in 1604. Bermuda was discovered by a group of shipwrecked Englishmen in 1609, and Jan Mayen was discovered by another whaler in 1615. Mauritius was discovered by the Dutch in 1638, with the dodo's extinction following shortly after. The French reached Réunion Island in 1642. The Dutch discovered Tristan da Cunha in 1643, and the English found the Falkland Islands in 1690, which remained fairly irrelevant until the days of Margaret Thatcher. The French discovered Rodriguez Island in 1691, and the Dutch discovered both St. Paul and Amsterdam Islands in 1696. Ascension Island was found by 60 shipwrecked Englishmen in 1701 who stayed there for 2 months. The French discovered the Seychelles in 1770, Kerguelen Islands in 1772, and once again, the tireless James Cook reached South Georgia in 1775. Lord Howe Island was discovered by the British in 1788, and the French reached Prince Edward Island in 1799. By around 1799, 1800, there wasn't much left to discover, but that didn't stop people from trying and succeeding. The South Shetland Islands were discovered by the British in 1819, Macquarie Island by the Russians in 1820, the South Orkney Islands by the British in 1821, and the Crozet Islands in 1821 as well, found by some British seal hunters who were shipwrecked and stranded there for over 2 years. Well, that's about everything, right? Except for the seventh continent, which is larger than Australia and located at the bottom of the globe. Antarctica had never been seen by human eyes until 1820, when a Russian explorer first sighted it but couldn't set foot on it. This means humans had observed the planet Uranus before anyone ever saw Antarctica. So after glimpsing it in 1820, it took some time before a landing on the continent was actually made. It wasn't until 1895 that the first confirmed landing took place by a team of Norwegians. And with that moment, every piece of land on planet Earth from 195,000 BCE to 1895 had finally been explored by the human species.